by first thanking those who took so much time to organize the conference. It's just been a wonderful experience, as well as those who came and presented earlier, wonderful ideas. And I'm really happy to be on a panel with Alexis and Megan, who I think are just doing great work in this area. I have a very simple, sort of specific question that I'm looking at today, and it's the effect of incarceration on neighborhood attainment. And it's an ongoing project that's been supported by the National Science Foundation, and it started when I was at Penn State, and it is a collaborative process with multiple people, including Glenn Firebaugh and Cody Warner. I had a bunch of slides about the sort of the expansion of the penal system, and then I just took them all out because other folks had done that. What I think is helpful from my perspective is in how I think about the penal system is I think about it as an emerging social institution. And so we are, as other folks have talked about, the sort of the world leaders in incarceration. But if you conceptualize it as a social institution, I started making some comparisons to other social institutions and the social implications that come from other social institutions. And so when we think about the prison system, who goes in is important, and it's also important because most people come out, and there's about 700,000 people a year who get out. So if we were going to make some comparisons, what would that look like? Well, in 2008, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, there was about 670,000 men who graduated with 4-year degrees. So about as many people get out of prison every year as men who graduate college. And so if you look at the university I'm at, and I was debating about whether or not to do this for the University of Michigan or Wisconsin, but I picked Wisconsin. There's about 400,000 living alumni at the University of Wisconsin, and in the history of the university, they've granted about 545,000 degrees. So in 1 year, the prison makes the sort of the collective impact of Wisconsin sort of look small. I've done a talk at Texas and Ohio State, and it's the same thing. But of course, prison is concentrated, right? It's concentrated racially, it's concentrated geographically, and that concentration has implications for understanding the consequences of incarceration. And folks have talked a lot, at great length, about the individual level outcomes, be it wages or be it health. And Chris Whittleman's done a lot of interesting work on family and children effects. And there are, of course, community effects, right? People have looked at community participation, civic representation. There's also been work that looks at the number of ex-inmates in a given community and the impact that that has on crime. I'm interested in a simple question, or we were interested in a simple question, and that's the impact of incarceration on residential outcomes, on where people live. And you ask the question, well, why should you care? And in a group full of people interested in health, we tend to know why neighborhoods matter. It's a profoundly important aspect of your life. It impacts life chances on all sorts of criminological venues like victimization, crime, the likelihood that you'll recidivate from crime. But it also impacts things like educational attainment. And importantly, for the purposes of this talk, it impacts things like health, mental health, child well-being, and cognitive functioning are all tied to the neighborhood that you live in. And so when we started probably about 4 years ago now, what did we think we know about the impact of incarceration on residential outcomes? And the prevailing logic at the time was it's the strongest. The causal impact of incarceration is the strongest for minorities. And specifically, some of the research in the area said African parolees enter tracts with more concentrated disadvantage, more instability, more heterogeneity than white parolees. And moreover, it gets worse over time. And what we started to ask was, is this an impact of incarceration? Is this a causal impact of incarceration? Or does the incarceration system just reproduce existing inequalities that are pervasive in contemporary American society, in particular residential inequalities? And that sort of tension, whether or not it was an impact of incarceration or a reproduction of existing inequality, is really what motivated us the whole time. And so we had a research design that departed a little bit from existing literature. And it isn't, in fact, that other folks who came before us thought differently. We all probably thought the same way, but it's incredibly difficult to say to someone, look, you're going to prison in 5 years, so I want to track all this information about you now, right? We weren't all that much smarter than anybody else. But what we did was we had a design where we tried to capture the effect of, we were really interested in that effect of the spell of incarceration on post-prison neighborhood characteristics, net of individual characteristics, and net of pre-prison neighborhood characteristics. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if I need it, but it's up there. And really what that departed from most work was we kind of had a black box about where people came before. And again, it isn't a function that other folks hadn't thought about it. It is really difficult, data-wise. It's very, very highly demanding data issues because we often don't have good information on where people came. So what did we do and how did we overcome it? Well, and before I get into that, I'll just sort of restate the most basic question. Do inmates live in more disadvantaged neighborhoods, controlling for where they came from? And does the effect vary by race, and does it change over time? These are the fundamental questions we were trying to tease out. And really, we weren't, well, we're certainly not any smarter, but we were much luckier than some other people in that we used an existing data set, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. It is a well-established and commonly used data set in the area. It started with about 13,000 people in 1979, and they were interviewed yearly. And then starting in 1994, they were interviewed every other year. There is a wealth of individual level data. It was created by the Bureau, I don't know if it was created, but it's certainly housed in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it has a host of economic indicators. It is a rich with individual level data. And there is also an indicator of residential location. Were you in prison? What they also have, and that's publicly available data, you can go to the website and download it. What they also have is a residential indicator at all waves. Where did you live? And we wrote an application and said, we'd like to have access to that. And they said, you can have it. And we were excited. And then they said, but to have it, you can only analyze the data in Washington, D.C. And so we thought about that, and we said, okay, we'll keep going. And so at the time I was at Penn State, and now I'm at Wisconsin. So anytime, so if you say, if I don't know the answer to a question, it's because I'll have to fly to Washington to find out the answer to the question. But nonetheless, the data was in D.C., and so it was very laborious because everything we had to do was in this cold room in Washington, D.C. with no access. But once we were granted access to the residential locations, we created a national database of census tract characteristics using this geolytics database. And we mapped out every possible census tract you could live in the country, and we plotted all the characteristics: percent poverty, percent poor, percent female-headed household, percent unemployed, percent immigration, like all the stuff that's available through the data set. And then we took that through the census, and then we took that to DC, and we ran this matching program where we matched where people lived with the relevant neighborhood characteristics. So what we have is a data set now that spans about 30 years, from 1979 to 2010. And we have repeated measures on individuals, we have repeated measures on incarceration history, and we have repeated measures on neighborhoods. So we felt fairly well positioned to try to meaningfully move forward what we think we know about the consequences of incarceration. And so our dependent variable is neighborhood disadvantage. It is a composite measure in a given census tract of percent poor, percent unemployed, percent female-headed households, and percent family on public assistance in a census tract. Now, people can and do disagree about the proper measurement of neighborhood disadvantage, but this is well used in the literature, with one exception, which I can talk about during the question and answer if people are interested. And we have two incarceration measures. One is, are you an ex-inmate? Have you gotten out of prison? And the second question is, how long have you been out of prison? And we controlled for all of the things we thought were relevant, both in predicting incarceration and predicting where people live: age, home ownership, the number of moves, educational attainment, poverty status, and so forth. And importantly, we controlled for neighborhood of origin. We controlled for where you lived. What I would also add is that it's 30 years of data. We're tracking people over time, and so all sorts of different things are going on, right? So our models got relatively complicated. And some of the things we had to think about were moving once might mean that you're moving to a better neighborhood, but moving 10, 15, 20 times might be indicative of something completely different. So we had to account for nonlinearities in the processes, right? At the same time, it could be that the neighborhoods themselves are changing. So we had to account for macro, secular trends in neighborhood conditions. The census is not a yearly indicator, right? It's every 10 years. And so we had to interpolate data in the middle. And that is commonly done, at least in the sociological framework. And the question is, if you interpolate, you assume a stable rate of change. And if you don't interpolate, you assume stability when you know there's change. So there are lots of different sort of decisions that we had to make and that we sort of worked through with reviewers. This paper has come out And the reviewers were incredibly helpful. They certainly made it a better paper. And a few other things to just keep in mind is that it's only the first spell of incarceration. We did not estimate. We are in the process of estimating what happens when you go back and go back and back again. And people are omitted for a reason I'll talk about, but people are omitted when they're in prison. And the reason that they're omitted is because the neighborhood conditions of the prison we wouldn't want that in our study, right? Because most people go to prison in a neighborhood that's dramatically better than where they lived before prison. So what I want to do is not in a complicated or statistical way, but I want to talk about our analytic approach. And we use something broadly defined called fixed effects regression. And substantively, that means that the data is transformed into person-period observations. What that really means is we're interested in people that are either 0 or 1s. And so you can imagine that pattern of 0s or 1s that I have up, that pattern of 0 or 1s. That's one hypothetical person, and they were not in prison for 6 years, and then they were in prison for 2 years, and then they were out of prison for another 6 years. The fundamental question that we're interested in is their life, their residential conditions in the 1 state different than their residential conditions in the 0 state? So you can think about this as sort of a classic before and after design, and there are sort of, it can be more complicated. I mean, it is more complicated than that, but not that much more, right? It's really just a classic before and after design. And the key difference is it's not comparing, and this gets to some of the points that Sean's talked about, it's not comparing incarcerated people to non-incarcerated people. It's comparing incarcerated people largely to themselves, okay? So it's about individual change in where you live. So it is a much more conservative test of the overall impact of incarceration. Not necessarily better or worse, it's just a different way to get at things. And so what we find is that our descriptive statistics are largely consistent with national averages. About 5% of the sample was incarcerated. This translates to about 600 people. Now, for analytic purposes, if it's a before and after design, right, we can't use people who started in prison and we can't use people who ended in prison. So people who were in prison at the beginning or the last data point had to be dropped. That left us with about 92% of the overall inmate population is what we were able to assess. And we followed them on average for about 6 waves. So we had lots of data on where people lived after prison. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about it in 3 ways, okay? I want to first talk about what our basic goal was. We wanted to replicate prior work. We wanted to replicate the work that said, look, this is the worst. It appears to be the worst for minorities. And we did that, and that's in the paper, and we replicated it. We almost did to the point, right? To the point estimate, we almost exactly replicated prior work. And then we essentially added one variable. Now in this process, adding one variable turns it from the regression model to a fixed effects framework. But we added one variable, and then we looked at the results again. So we added just where you came from. And so I'll talk about the results in 3 ways. I'll talk about the main effect of incarceration, and then I'll look at the race-specific models. And I'm only going to talk about the key effects. If people are interested, I have these long-winded, kind of, I think, boring tables. But what I'll do is just talk about the main effects that we were most interested in. And higher scores indicate more disadvantage. Now, it's a little bit messy because it's a composite indicator of all these different things, and I'm going to talk about it compared to a few other effects in a second. But higher scores indicate more disadvantage. And what we see is that once we control for where folks came from, there was no effect of incarceration on where people lived. They didn't, as a whole, ex-inmates did not live in worse neighborhoods. And we found that African Americans did not live in worse neighborhoods after prison. We found the effect was only among white ex-inmates. The Hispanic population in the NLSY 79 is something we talk about, but I omitted it for the purposes, thank you, for the purposes of this talk. So if we think about it, we found no effect for the whole sample, and we find no effect for the white sample, only an effect among African Americans. Now keeping in mind, only an effect for whites, thank you. Now keeping in mind that we completely replicated the results that other folks had found without the inclusion of where folks came from. So when I said I'll talk about it in context, the context is if you think about a disadvantaged distribution, whites who are in prison are about 15% worse on the disadvantaged distribution. So they slide down the scale about 15%, and every year it gets about 2 to 3% worse. That is comparable to the difference between those who are employed and those who are unemployed, and that is the same as about a year of educational attainment. So if you think about it compared to some of the other things that folks have really talked about, it's a large effect among the white population and not an effect among overall inmates or African American inmates. And we thought a lot about this notion of, is it incarceration as a form of sort of coercive mobility? And there's two possibilities, right? It is possible that inmates return to the same community, but that community has gotten worse. Now, we did account for what we would call macro-secular trends. But nonetheless, it is possible that individuals return to the same neighborhood, and that neighborhood has just gotten worse. Or what we argue is that incarceration pushes individuals to different and worse neighborhoods. And so we leveraged the longitudinal nature of our data. Within 2 years, and by 2 years we mean before the second time someone had been re-interviewed. So it should really be two survey periods. 75% of our sample had moved. So we looked at the results only among people who moved, right? Not people who went back home, only the effects among people who moved. And we found that the effects were significantly stronger. So it was really a story of people moving to different and worse neighborhoods within essentially 2 to 3 years of getting out of incarceration, with being released from prison. And so we started thinking about why is this the case? And there's all sorts of literature on residential mobility and the consequences of incarceration, and people had talked about post-release housing restrictions. Felons can only live in certain areas. And people, and including some of my own work, right, have talked about sort of fractured social ties that folks have, and we know that one way people generate resources is through social ties. And inmates in both of those situations are disadvantaged, clearly. There's also work in the sort of the assimilation perspective, so people who are very interested in residential mobility and segregation, that look at structural barriers that some groups face. And one of the structural barriers they often talk about is discrimination. And so you can argue that incarceration is another structural barrier. These lead to a sort of a legal differentiation of the treatment of ex-inmates. And at the end of the day, what we did with more analysis was look at the realities of the residential conditions and residential inequality in the United States. And so what we found when we looked at the data was that a white felon lived in a neighborhood, 9 out of 10 white felons lived in a neighborhood that would essentially live in a better neighborhood than the average African American in our sample. So what that tells us is that there wasn't much room down for African Americans to go. They are drawn from the worst neighborhoods in the country. And so despite what we think is some very negative effects of incarceration, there was a floor effect that Sean was talking about. They couldn't go down anymore. And whites had simply more to lose residentially from a trip to incarceration. And so when we started thinking about the contributions of our study, we thought about how it's important to consider where people come from. And at a minimum, by not accounting for where people come from, for where people are drawn, where the prison draws people from, there's an overestimation of the effect and there's an inversion of the effect. And empirically, the one variable where you came from, and you could set up models differently, and part of what professors do a lot is play with data. Where you come from is and I would say it's more important than all the other variables in the model, okay? So that was as important as everything else in terms of predicting where you live later is where you live now. It was as important as the other 17 variables in the model put together. The substantive contributions, I think, are pretty straightforward, right? The one is this notion of neighborhood disadvantage and how incarceration contributes to neighborhood disadvantage. And I think it has implications for patterns of residential mobility. And where you live has huge health implications. And so thinking about our results within the context of the overall influence of neighborhoods on health, I think, is important. And I think it's important to think about the scope and the role of punishment in society. What do we want? What are the impact? What do we want the goal? What are the goals of the justice system? What are we trying to accomplish with incarceration? And what is it doing? And I think that I think that's important to think about, and I hope that that's one contribution of our study is pushing people a little bit to think about the consequences of incarceration and what we really want to do with this grand social experiment. And I would close just by saying it just recently came out the article just recently came out in the American Sociological Review, and here's the citation to the work. So thank you for your time.